The November air had a damp, insistent chill that seeped through the seams of Ilara's coat, a garment that had seen one too many winters. It was a thin barrier against the encroaching dusk, a time of day she had come to associate with a specific type of fatigue, one that settled deep in her bones. Liam, however, was impervious to the cold, a small, vibrant star of energy in the muted landscape of the playground. At 7, his world was a series of immediate, pressing concerns: the structural integrity of a fortress built from wet sand, the optimal angle for a successful slide, the profound injustice of having to leave when the fun was just beginning. He was her sun, and she was the planet that quietly, tiredly, orbited him, drawing warmth and purpose from his light. She checked her phone, the cracked screen showing a time that meant the grocery store would be crowded and the checkout lines long. Another calculation, another small compromise. They could have pasta again. Liam liked pasta. She was working on it. That was the phrase she repeated to herself, a mantra against the rising tide of anxieties. She was working on building a life for them, a real one, not this threadbare existence of patched coats and second-hand toys. Her work as a freelance bookkeeper provided just enough to keep them afloat, a precarious balancing act of invoices and receipts, of chasing clients for payment while her own bills gathered on the small table in their apartment. The numbers she organized for other people's lives, so clean and orderly in their columns, stood in stark contrast to the chaotic mess of her own finances. Her potential, she knew, was a dormant thing, a textbook on architectural theory gathering dust on a shelf, a relic from a life she had planned before it was derailed by a charming man who promised partnership and delivered only debt and disillusionment. The divorce had left her with Liam, her greatest joy, and a cavernous distrust of easy promises. So she focused on the tangible, on the small certainties of balancing a ledger and making sure her son had a warm bed and a full stomach. It was not the life she had dreamed of, but it was a life she was building with her own two hands, however tired they might be. Liam's shout pulled her from her thoughts. He was standing by the park bench, his red boots planted firmly on the damp wood chips, pointing at something. It was a portfolio, a sleek, dark leather case that looked profoundly out of place among the discarded juice boxes and fallen leaves. It was the kind of object that belonged in a boardroom, not a municipal park at twilight. It radiated an aura of expense and importance, its brass clasps gleaming dully under the jaundiced light of the park lamps. Her first instinct was a jolt of something akin to fear. It was a piece of someone else's world, a world of consequence and wealth that felt alien and intimidating. Liam, however, saw it only as a treasure. He picked it up, his small hand struggling with its weight and size. He carried it to her like a prize, his face alight with the thrill of discovery. She took it from him, the leather cool and smooth beneath her fingers. It felt heavy, substantial. A part of her, the desperate part that tallied grocery bills in her head while trying to sleep, whispered about what might be inside. But it was a fleeting thought, extinguished by a deeper, more ingrained sense of propriety. This was not hers. It was a problem, an obligation. She opened the clasp. There was no cash, only a sheaf of papers, thick and heavy. On top was a driver's license, tucked into a small pocket. The name was Julian Croft. The face in the photo was severe, handsome in a way that seemed humorless, with dark eyes that looked straight through the camera. Beneath the license were architectural blueprints, intricate and complex, covered in notes written in a sharp, decisive hand. She recognized the technical language, the symbols, the precise lines. A ghost of her old self, the student who had loved the logic and beauty of design, felt a faint stirring of interest. This was not just a portfolio, it was a piece of someone's work, their thoughts, their creation. It felt intimate, personal. The need to return it became more than an obligation, it became a matter of respect. The address on the license was for a building downtown, one of the new glass and steel towers that had reshaped the city's skyline. It was a place she only ever saw from a distance, a glittering monument to a life she couldn't imagine. The next day, after dropping Liam at school, she stood before it, the portfolio clutched in her hand like a passport to a foreign country. The lobby was a vast, silent space of polished marble and cool, conditioned air. It smelled of money and floor wax. A woman at a monolithic reception desk looked at her, her gaze lingering for a moment on Ilara's practical boots and worn coat before becoming professionally blank. Ilara felt a familiar prickle of inadequacy, the sense of being out of place, of being judged and found wanting. She steeled herself, approached the desk, and explained her purpose in a low, steady voice. The receptionist's expression shifted from indifference to a flicker of surprise. A few moments and a hushed phone call later, Ilara was directed to a private elevator. The elevator ascended in unnerving silence, opening directly into a penthouse apartment. The space was immense, a panorama of glass walls that offered a breathtaking, dizzying view of the city below. The furnishings were sparse and brutally modern: a long, low sofa, a single stark painting, a steel enwood dining table that could have seated 12. It was less a home than a statement, a declaration of taste and control. And standing in the middle of it all was the man from the driver's license, Julian Croft. He was taller than she had expected, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, though his tie was loosened and his collar unbuttoned. He looked just as severe as his photo, but in person, she could see the faint shadows of exhaustion under his eyes, a weariness that the harsh lighting of the apartment did nothing to soften. He was observing her with an unnerving stillness, his dark eyes taking in the portfolio in her hands, her flushed cheeks, her determinately neutral expression. She held out the portfolio. He took it, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The contact was brief, almost non-existent, yet it sent a strange current through her. He didn't open it, just held it at his side. He was watching her face, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the city far below. She felt an absurd urge to smooth down her hair, to apologize for her less than perfect appearance, but she resisted. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply returned something that was lost. She met his gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated by the opulence of her surroundings or the intensity of his scrutiny. She saw the confidence, the power that was as much a part of him as his expensive suit, but she also saw something else, something deeper. A flicker of loneliness, perhaps, or a profound isolation that the vast, empty apartment seemed to amplify. He was a man who commanded worlds from this glass tower, yet he seemed utterly alone within it. He finally spoke, his voice deeper than she had imagined. He thanked her, the words formal and precise. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a wallet. She immediately held up a hand, a small, involuntary gesture of refusal. She had not come for a reward. The idea felt vaguely insulting, as if her honesty were a service for sale. Her refusal seemed to surprise him. He paused, his hand hovering over his wallet. He lowered it slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. He asked why. The question was direct, unadorned with social pleasantries. It was a genuine inquiry, and it demanded a genuine answer. She thought for a moment, searching for the right words. She could have given a simple, polite excuse, but his directness compelled an equal measure of honesty. "It was not mine to keep," she said. The words were simple, but they held the entire weight of her principles, the quiet code she lived by. She added, thinking of the blueprints, it looked important. Too important to be left on a park bench. A subtle shift occurred in his expression. The hard, assessing look softened into something more complex, something that looked like genuine curiosity. He gestured toward the sofa, an invitation to sit, but she shook her head gently. She needed to leave. This world was not hers, and staying felt like trespassing. She had fulfilled her duty, and now she needed to return to her own life, to Liam, to the columns of numbers that awaited her. As she turned to go, he spoke again, his voice stopping her at the door. He asked for her name. She gave it to him. Ilara. Just Ilara. He repeated it quietly, as if testing the sound of it in the vast, silent room. He thanked her again, and this time, the words felt different, less like a formality and more like a genuine acknowledgement. As she rode the silent elevator back down to the world she knew, she felt his gaze on her back, a strange, lingering sensation of having been seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long time. 2 days passed, and the encounter began to feel like a strange dream, a brief, surreal detour from the predictable path of her life. She was at her small desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating the lines of fatigue on her face, when her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. She almost ignored it, assuming it was another client chasing an invoice, but something made her answer. The voice on the other end was Julian Croft's. It was startling to hear it again, stripped of the echoes of his cavernous apartment, sounding closer, more immediate. He was direct, as before. He had looked her up. He knew she was a bookkeeper. The statement was so bald, so devoid of pretext, that it left her momentarily speechless. She felt a flash of resentment at the invasion of her privacy, but it was quickly replaced by a wary curiosity. Why would a man like him bother to find out who she was? He explained. He ran a private charitable foundation, a legacy from his late father. It was, he admitted, a passion project that had been managed with more heart than sense. The finances were a disaster, a tangled mess of well-intentioned but poorly documented expenditures. He needed someone to untangle it, to impose order on the chaos. He needed someone meticulous, someone with integrity. He was offering her a short-term contract to audit the foundation's books. The figure he named was staggering. It was more than she earned in 6 months of chasing small freelance gigs. It was enough to pay for a security deposit on a better apartment, to buy Liam a new winter coat without a pang of guilt, to fix the rattling noise in her aging car. It was a lifeline. Her immediate reaction was suspicion. It was a cold, familiar reflex, a defense mechanism honed by years of disappointment. Why her? There were thousands of accountants in the city, people with more experience, with proper firms and polished resumes. It made no sense. It was too easy, too good to be true. Her ex-husband had been a master of the grand, easy gesture, promises that glittered on the surface and crumbled to dust upon inspection. She had learned, the hard way, that every offer had a price, and the price was often hidden. She questioned him, her voice carefully neutral, trying to mask the churning conflict within her. Why not a large firm? Why a freelancer he knew nothing about? His answer, once again, was disarmingly direct. He said the large firms he had used in the past were adept at finding what they were told to find, at smoothing over inconvenient truths. He said he needed someone who would simply see what was there. He said he had a feeling she was that kind of person. He mentioned the portfolio. He said that anyone who would go to that much trouble to return something for no reward was either a fool or a person of unusual integrity. He was betting on the latter. The compliment, if it was one, was so starkly delivered that it disarmed her. He was not flattering her, he was stating his assessment, his reason for the gamble. She heard the genuine weariness in his voice when he spoke of his father's legacy, the frustration of dealing with a mess that was both professional and deeply personal. And beneath the suspicion, a small, tentative flicker of hope began to burn. What if it was real? What if this was the chance she had been waiting for, the opportunity to use her skills for something meaningful, to finally get ahead? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. It meant stepping out of the familiar trench of her struggles and into the unknown. It meant trusting a stranger, a powerful man from a different world. It meant being vulnerable again. She looked around her small, cramped apartment, at the stack of bills on the table, at the crayon drawing Liam had taped to the wall. This was her reality. The offer was a door to a different one. She took a deep breath. She told him she would agree to a 1-week trial. A test, for both of them. If he was not satisfied with her work, or if she was not comfortable with the arrangement, they would part ways, no questions asked. It was a compromise, a way to mitigate the risk while still seizing the opportunity. He agreed immediately, his voice holding a note of what sounded like respect for her caution. After they hung up, she sat in silence for a long time, her heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm against her ribs. She had just made a decision that could change everything. The offices of Croft Enterprises were located in the same glittering tower as his apartment, a few dozen floors below. The environment was hushed, efficient, and intimidating. People moved with a quiet, focused energy, their clothes immaculate, their expressions professionally serene. Ilara felt like a wren in a flock of swans. She was given a small, glass-walled office with a view of a neighboring skyscraper. The files for the foundation were delivered in a series of cardboard boxes, a daunting mountain of paper that represented years of chaotic generosity. For the first few days, she spoke to no one. She kept her head down, immersing herself in the work. She ate lunch at her desk, a sandwich she brought from home, and left precisely at 5 to pick up Liam. She was a ghost in the machine, a temporary cog, and that was how she wanted it. The work itself was a fascinating puzzle. Julian had not exaggerated. The foundation's bookkeeping was a masterpiece of disorganization. Receipts were missing, entries were cryptic, and large sums were allocated with little more than a handwritten note. But as she began to dig, to sort and categorize, a story emerged. It was the story of his father, a man who had clearly operated on impulse and compassion, funding a small art program here, a community garden there, all with a cheerful disregard for proper procedure. She found herself feeling a strange affection for this man she had never met, this chaotic philanthropist. And within the chaos, she began to see patterns, the faint outlines of a system that no one else had bothered to look for. Her mind, so long occupied with the mundane arithmetic of survival, felt sharp and alive. She was good at this. She had almost forgotten the deep, quiet satisfaction of solving a complex problem. Julian left her alone, a fact for which she was grateful. He was a constant but distant presence, a figure she sometimes saw striding down the long hallway, always on his way to a meeting, always surrounded by an entourage of serious-looking people. But then, on the fourth morning, he appeared at the door of her office, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He placed one on her desk without a word and leaned against the doorframe, sipping from his own. The gesture was so unexpected, so normal, that it threw her off balance. He asked how it was going. She gave him a brief, professional summary of her progress, pointing to the neat stacks of files she had created from the initial mess. He nodded, but his eyes were on her, not the files. He seemed to be looking for a different kind of answer. He asked about a specific project, a grant to a small inner-city music school. The file was thin, the details sparse. He wanted to know what she thought of it. It was a strange question to ask a bookkeeper. She hesitated, then decided to answer honestly. She told him that from a purely financial perspective, it was a poor investment with no clear metrics for success. But then she told him about a thank you letter she had found tucked into the file, a letter from a young girl who had been able to learn the violin because of the grant. The letter was written in a child's careful cursive, full of misspelled words and earnest gratitude. She said that sometimes the most important returns could not be quantified on a balance sheet. A silence fell between them. He was looking at her with that same intense, unreadable expression she remembered from his apartment. He seemed to see past the professional facade to the woman who understood the value of a child's thank you note. Another time, she was working late, trying to reconcile a particularly confusing set of accounts. The office was dark and quiet, the city a glittering tapestry outside her window. She was so engrossed that she didn't hear him approach. He was standing in the doorway, his jacket off, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He didn't ask what she was doing. He simply looked at the clock on the wall, then at her. "Go home, Ilara," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Go home to your son. This can wait until tomorrow." The simple command, the acknowledgement of her life outside of these glass walls, struck her with surprising force. It was a small act of consideration, but it felt monumental. It was a sign that he saw her not just as a contractor, a temporary solution to a problem, but as a person. A mother. The trial week ended, and another began. The work continued, and with it, these small, quiet moments of connection accumulated, like dust motes gathering in a sunbeam, slowly forming something solid and real. One evening, as she was packing up, he asked her to stay for a few minutes. He wanted to explain something. He led her to his own office, a vast corner suite with a view that seemed to encompass the entire world. He stood by the window, his back to her, and began to talk about his father. He spoke of their difficult relationship, of the pressure to live up to the legacy of a man he had both admired and resented. He explained that after his father's death, the foundation had been managed by his father's business partner, a man Julian had known his whole life, a man he had trusted like an uncle. It was this man, he explained, who had let the foundation's finances devolve into such chaos, not out of malice, but out of a combination of incompetence and a desire to hide his own mismanagement from Julian. When Julian finally took a closer look, he had uncovered a series of bad investments and foolish expenditures that the partner had been trying to conceal. Firing him, Julian said, had been one of the hardest things he had ever had to do. It was a betrayal that had cut deep, leaving him with a profound sense of distrust. He turned to face her then, his eyes dark with the memory of it. "That's why I needed someone from the outside," he said. "Someone with no agenda. Someone I could trust." In that moment, the power dynamic between them vanished. He was not her billionaire boss, he was just a man who had been hurt, who was struggling to protect his father's legacy, who was grappling with the loneliness of his position. And she, who knew the sting of betrayal so intimately, understood him perfectly. As she delved deeper into the foundation's accounts, moving from the recent past into older records from the time of the ex-partner's oversight, Ilara's trained eye began to notice a faint but persistent anomaly. It was a ghost in the machine, a whisper in the numbers. A series of payments, made on a recurring quarterly basis, to a vendor she couldn't identify. The company name was Generic Logistical Solutions Incorporated, and the invoices were vague, citing only consulting services. The amounts were not huge, just small enough to fly under the radar in a multi-million-dollar budget, but they were consistent, a steady, methodical bleed. Her curiosity piqued. She started a separate file, a private investigation within the larger audit. She cross-referenced dates, invoice numbers, and payment authorizations. Most were signed by the former partner. That was not surprising. But the payments had continued for a full year after his departure, authorized by a low-level clerk who had since left the company. She felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This was more than just mismanagement. This was deliberate. She spent 2 sleepless nights tracing the Shell Corporation, using online resources and cross-referencing public records. It was a dead end, a post office box in another state. But she didn't give up. She went back to the numbers, her greatest strength. She noticed that the payments always occurred 3 days after the foundation received a major donation from a specific corporate sponsor. It was a pattern, subtle but undeniable. A parasite feeding on the host. This discovery changed the nature of her work. It was no longer just about cleaning up a mess, it was about uncovering a crime. And it was a crime that threatened the foundation's reputation, particularly a new, high-profile partnership they were about to announce with that same corporate sponsor. If this came out at the wrong time, it could be catastrophic. The knowledge sat like a stone in her chest. She debated how to approach Julian. An accusation of this magnitude was a dangerous thing. The ex-partner was clearly the main suspect, but the continuation of the payments after his departure suggested a more complex scheme, perhaps one with accomplices still inside the company. What if she was wrong? What if there was a simple explanation she was missing? Her old insecurities surfaced, the voice of her ex-husband whispering in her ear, telling her she was overreaching, that she was just a bookkeeper, that she should leave these things to the important people. But then she thought of the little girl with the violin, of the community gardens, of the well-intentioned chaos of Julian's father. She thought of Julian's own story of betrayal. She could not stay silent. Integrity demanded action. She requested a meeting with him, her voice betraying none of the anxiety she felt. She laid out her findings on the polished table in his office, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a series of calm, logical observations. She didn't use the word embezzlement, she simply pointed to the pattern. The recurring payments. The vague invoices. The Shell Corporation. The correlation with the donor's schedule. She presented it as a question, an anomaly that required his attention. She watched his face carefully as she spoke. He listened without interruption, his expression hardening into a mask of intense concentration. His stillness was absolute. He didn't look at the papers, he looked at her, his eyes searching hers, assessing her certainty, her methodology. When she finished, the silence in the room was heavy, charged. She had expected a range of possible reactions: anger, denial, a defensive dismissal. Her ex-husband would have belittled her, accused her of creating drama. But Julian did none of those things. He looked down at the spreadsheet she had prepared, his finger tracing one of the payment streams. Then he looked back at her. His response was quiet, direct, and utterly transformative. He believed her. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He didn't question her skills or her motives. He simply accepted her analysis as fact. His trust in her was so complete, so instantaneous, that it took her breath away. He asked her what she thought they should do next. He said he was not delegating, he was inviting her into the inner circle, making her a partner in solving the crisis she had uncovered. In that moment, she felt a profound sense of validation, a recognition of her competence that was more valuable than any paycheck. He was not just trusting her numbers, he was trusting her. They worked together for the next week, a small, clandestine team of 2, assisted only by his most trusted lawyer. They operated out of his office after hours, the city lights their only witness. It was an intense, focused period that blurred the lines between their professional roles. He deferred to her expertise on the financial trail, listening intently as she explained the complex web of transactions she had untangled. She, in turn, was impressed by his quick, strategic mind, his ability to see the larger legal and corporate implications of every piece of data she uncovered. They developed an easy, efficient rhythm, a partnership built on mutual respect. Her detailed, meticulous work provided the roadmap, and his resources and authority provided the means to follow it. She was the one who finally found the key, a single, miscoded wire transfer that linked the Shell Corporation not only to the ex-partner but also to the low-level clerk, who turned out to be his nephew. It was the smoking gun, the undeniable proof they needed. With the evidence secure, Julian moved swiftly. Legal proceedings were initiated, the authorities were discreetly involved, and the situation was contained before it could damage the Foundation's reputation. The crisis was averted, the stolen funds were on a path to being recovered, and the integrity of his father's legacy was secured. It was a quiet, decisive victory. On the day it was all officially resolved, Ilara found a simple, handwritten note on her desk. It said only, "Dinner tonight. 7 o'clock. I'll drive." It was not a question. It was a statement. He took her to a small, elegant restaurant tucked away on a quiet side street, the kind of place that didn't advertise its existence. The atmosphere was intimate, the tables spaced far apart, the lighting low and warm. It was a world away from the cold, corporate environment where they had spent the last several weeks. She had been nervous getting ready, feeling acutely aware of the simplicity of her best dress, the modest price of her shoes. But the moment she saw him waiting for her, dressed in a simple dark sweater and trousers, his demeanor relaxed and free of the tension he had carried for weeks, her anxiety melted away. He looked at her as she approached, and the way he looked at her made her feel more beautiful than she had in years. Over dinner, they barely spoke of the fraud. The topic felt like it belonged to another time, another place. Instead, he asked her about her life before Liam, about her passion for architecture. She found herself talking about her dreams, about the buildings she had wanted to design, ideas she had not spoken of to anyone in nearly a decade. He listened with that same focused intensity she had come to know, asking insightful questions, drawing out a part of herself she thought she had buried forever. She, in turn, asked him about his life outside the tower of glass and steel. He spoke of a love for sailing, a passion inherited from his father, and the sense of freedom he felt on the open water. He was different here, more open, more vulnerable. The formidable chief executive was gone, replaced by a man who spoke with quiet passion about the sea and the sky. As the meal drew to a close, he grew serious. He looked at her across the table, his gaze direct and unwavering. He told her that her contract with the Foundation was officially complete. A pang of disappointment, sharp and unexpected, went through her. She had known this was coming, but hearing the words still felt like a loss. But then he continued. He said that what she had done was more than just fulfill a contract. "You didn't just fix the books, Ilara," he said, his voice low and sincere. "You restored a piece of my father's legacy. You saw the truth when everyone else just saw numbers. You have a clarity and an integrity that is rare." He paused, searching for the right word. He thanked her, not just for the work, but for her character. The acknowledgement was so profound, so specific, that it brought a lump to her throat. No one had ever seen her so clearly. Then he leaned forward slightly, closing the small distance between them. "I don't want this to be the end of our association," he said. "I would like to see you again. Outside of this office." The words hung in the air, simple, direct, and freighted with possibility. It was not a line, not a casual proposition. It was an invitation, a clear statement of intent. It was a question that required an answer. For a moment, all the old fears, the old wounds, whispered their warnings. But then she looked into his eyes, and she saw no pretense, no agenda. She saw only a man who had seen her for exactly who she was and valued it. A man who had shown her trust and respect from the very beginning. She felt a smile, a real, unburdened smile, spread across her face. "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much." The single word was an acceptance not just of a date, but of a future she had stopped allowing herself to imagine. It was the beginning of something new. 6 months later, the light in Ilara's new apartment was different. It was a warm, afternoon light that streamed through large, clean windows, illuminating the cheerful clutter of a life being well lived. They had moved 3 months ago to a place in a quieter neighborhood with a small park right across the street. It was not a penthouse in the sky, but it was a home, spacious and bright, with enough room for Liam's Lego creations to spread across the living room floor without becoming a major hazard. She had a new job, a permanent one. Julian had created a position for her as the director of operations for the foundation, giving her full autonomy to manage its finances and projects with the integrity and vision she had already demonstrated. She was not just surviving anymore, she was thriving. The work was challenging and meaningful, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of professional pride, of her potential being not just recognized, but utilized. The change was more than just financial or professional. It was a deeper, more fundamental shift in the texture of her daily life. The constant, low-grade anxiety that had been her companion for so long had receded, replaced by a quiet sense of peace, a feeling of security that was both new and profoundly welcome. Her relationship with Julian had grown slowly, cautiously at first, then with an increasing sense of certainty and rightness. He was a steady, grounding presence in her life, and she, in his. He was still the powerful, decisive chief executive at the office, but here, in her home, he was just Julian. He was the man who could be completely absorbed in helping Liam find the last, elusive edge piece of a 1,000-piece puzzle of the solar system, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was the man who would sit on her small balcony with her on a summer evening, sharing a bottle of wine and a comfortable silence as the sun went down. He never tried to fix her life with grand, sweeping gestures of wealth. He understood, with an innate perception that still surprised her, that what she needed was not to be rescued, but to be supported. He celebrated her independence. When she had insisted on paying the security deposit for the new apartment herself, from the salary she had earned, he had simply nodded, his eyes filled with a deep, quiet respect that meant more to her than any gift he could have bought. Their partnership was one of equals, a careful, deliberate weaving together of two very different lives. He brought a sense of expansive possibility into her world, and she brought a sense of grounded reality into his. She and Liam had breached the walls of his beautiful, lonely fortress, filling it not with things, but with laughter, with the messy, unpredictable, wonderful chaos of family. On this particular Saturday afternoon, the three of them were on the floor of the new living room, deep in the final stages of the solar system puzzle. Liam, with the solemn focus of a brain surgeon, was trying to fit a piece of Saturn's rings into place. Julian was sorting the last few pieces by color, his long fingers surprisingly deft. Elara sat back on her heels, watching them. The scene was so simple, so ordinary, yet it felt like a miracle. The quiet contentment in the room was a tangible thing, a warm, heavy blanket. Liam finally clicked the piece into place with a triumphant shout. Julian looked up at Elara, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and transformed his usually severe features into something open and boyishly handsome. He caught her gaze and held it, and in that shared look, an entire conversation passed between them, a conversation of gratitude, of affection, of a shared, sustainable happiness that had been built, piece by careful piece, just like the puzzle before them. She thought back to that cold, dreary evening in the park, to the heavy leather portfolio that had felt like a relic from another universe. It was strange to think how such a small, random event could pivot a life onto an entirely new axis. But as she looked at Julian's smiling face and at her son, so happy and secure, she realized the truth. The turning point had not been finding the portfolio. The turning point had been the choice she made afterward. The decision to walk to that imposing tower, to face the intimidating stranger, to refuse the reward, to simply do the right thing because it was the right thing. It was that small, quiet act of integrity, a reflection of the person she had always been, that had set everything in motion. It had not brought her a reward in the way she might have once understood the word. It had brought her something far more valuable. It had brought her recognition. It had brought her a partner. It had brought her home.